most everybody knows who you are, but I just wanted to say a few words about who you are. And I also wanted to thank a couple of people who've put all this together. So I wanted to thank Andy Matson, of course, the Dean of Students, Claudia Marin Andrade, Khalif Matulis, who was president of the Student Government Association. All of them have been very active and helpful in making this happen. And then just a few quick things about you, that you became interested in journalism during your junior year at Yale when you worked as an intern at the Forward publication. You later wrote for a number of publications, including the Wall Street Journal Europe, the Daily News, and Politico. And in 2011, you became the founding editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News, which won a National Magazine Award in 2016, a George Polk Award in 2018, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prizes in international reporting in 2017 and 2018. BuzzFeed published a number of scoops, including the famous Steele dossier in 2017. And in January 2020, just this year, you became the media columnist for the New York Times. And just as a note to conclude on this, the New Republic recently described you as, quotes, the best media columnist the New York Times has ever had. So with that, I turn it back to you, Ben.
Okay, well now I feel jinxed. But thank you all again so much for having me. And yeah, it's nice to see human beings. I'm spending a lot of time home alone these days. And yeah, I guess I thought maybe it'd be valuable to talk a little bit about how I got into this and sort of what's happening across the industry, and yeah, which I guess a lot of you are thinking about getting into. And when we were talking before, maybe Professor Friedman said to talk about how like sort of getting into this journalism at a difficult time. And like the good news is it was probably a difficult time when John got into journalism. Like the news business has been in trouble for so long that there really was, it's like been like 75 years since it was like a really great booming time to get into journalism. So we all kind of got into it at a difficult time. So at least if that's some small consolation. But you know, I think my own career just really based on timing and how old I am, really sort of followed these deep changes that, you know, we're all kind of living through in technology and media. I mean, I got out of college and I'm from New York, like a lot of you. And so I thought it would be like extreme, and having done a summer internship at the Jewish Forward, this small Jewish newspaper where I like really fell in love with reporting. I got a gig at the Indianapolis Star, which was like, you know, far away and exotic for me in the middle of the country, and did some police reporting there, and then reported went to Eastern Europe for a little while and was a stringer there for the Wall Street Journal, but happened to come back to New York in 2001, 2002, just as like these things called blogs, which I feel like now I have to like explain what blogs are because it was like been so long since anybody had a blog, but they were like the hot new thing in 2002, 2003. And I followed like I was at the New York Observer, you know, reading blogs about the 2004 presidential campaign. And there were these blogs that like really were like holding the mainstream media to account and really became very important. There was a huge scoop about President Bush that turned out to be based on fake documents, and a bunch of right-wing bloggers uncovered it. And so I was covering local news in New York, and there were no blogs, and this was like this brand new thing. And so I started one, and it was just such a different moment, but it was so easy to break news. Like you could go to, the mayor would have a press conference at like 11 a.m. and you could go and have lunch and like hang around for a while. And then at 2 p.m., just write what the mayor had said at his 11 a.m. press conference. And that would be the only way that somebody who wanted to know what had happened at the press conference could find out about it until midnight, which was when the New York Times published. The New York Times would put the next day's paper on online. Every story just go online at midnight. And so either you, so like, it was just, I mean, it was sort of this like, for a while, it was this sort of candy from a baby thing where it was just, you, if you just wrote about what had happened that day on the internet, on your blog, you were the only source on that. And so I started like a handful of the first New York political blogs. And when that, and when, and when sort of, you know, blogs has, and they had often started as these kind of personal places where people, you know, wrote about what they'd had for breakfast or ranted about their own political views. And I think what I had done was sort of professionalize it a bit. Like I was a reporter doing journalism that happened to be on a blog. And what Politico did was take that to a national level and start a news site that was competing with the then print Washington Post, and, you know, and taking these internet tools, and really like it's hard to imagine a world where publications weren't regularly writing things and putting them on the internet, but that was very much the world. Like often there'd be some story you really wanted to read and it would be in a PDF, and you'd have to like find the PDF somewhere, and somebody would like illegally put the PDF online and then they'd take it down. And like, it was, you know, it feels like a million years ago. And so Politico, I covered the Clinton and Obama campaigns again on a blog. And, you know, and the sort of, and the speed of the news site, you know, and at that point, this was less exotic, but if you took video, that was still a place where, you know, and it was less exotic. And so I had to break real news. I couldn't just get away with saying, hey, here's what just happened. Everybody was doing that. And so, you know, so I was reporting and covering the thing and breaking news. But also, you know, the striking thing was how far behind the mainstream media was lagging us. You know, for instance, I had a little video recorder, and I would take it to you know, Obama would give a speech and I would videotape the speech. And behind me, you know, if you've ever been to a political event or some kind of big event, there'll be a big wall of cameras behind you where there's, you know, all these, you know, every television network has a camera. And so there's 20 cameras behind you and they're all filming. And what they would then do is they'd go back to their trucks and they'd feed the video to an editor, and over maybe several hours later, you know, maybe 12 seconds of this hour-long speech would make it onto the evening news. And if you wanted to know what Obama had said or see it, like that's what you would wait for. And so I would just kind of like take my shaky video camera, upload the video onto the internet. And again, for a little while, you're the only one doing that. And it was this competitive advantage. I mean, pretty quickly, the professionals with the real cameras catch up with you and start doing that too. But it was really striking how slow these big institutions were to adjust to these very, very rapid changes. And the next round of changes really came in like 2009, 2010, where I had been writing this blog, and at some point you could just feel that all the politicians who were reading your blog, all the journalists who were reading your blog, the regular people who cared about politics who were reading your blog, they'd all moved over to Twitter. We're all yelling at each other on Twitter. You know, if you were a blogger, what you wanted to do is to get people to talk about your blog on Twitter. And so, and Twitter had really become the kind of central force in the political and news universe that it is now. And so in 2011, this guy named Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, approached me. And BuzzFeed was then like the world's leading cat website, and like obviously, you know, still is. But that was all it was. And so I was like kind of confused about why this guy who, you know, was very focused on publishing lists of cats was calling me up because I was a political journalist. But what he sort of explained to me was that we were sort of moving into a world where when people opened their computers, it used to be that you would go to, you know, NewYorkTimes.com, thecatalyst.com, but people were starting to type in Facebook.com and Twitter.com. This was before apps. But, you know, Pinterest.com, StumbleUpon, if anybody remembers that one. But these social networks that, and that the goal for a journalist had become not, I want to get my thing on the front page of our website at Politico. It had become, I want people on Twitter to talk about it. And it's a different set of incentives. It's a different way of thinking about media, to say like, what will people talk about? What will people share? What will people like actively share? And on Facebook at that point, it was very much like 21 animals who are disappointed in you. On Twitter, it was journalism and scoops and new news and the kind of stuff that reporters really get excited to do. It wasn't like, here's what happened today, here's my story about what happened today. It was like, oh my God, have you heard this new piece of news? And that's what reporters like to do. And so it was really exciting to come over to BuzzFeed and build a news organization that was kind of based on the premise that like the only thing that matters is breaking news, is getting into the conversation, is doing stuff that's really new. Um, and so I was there for 8 years, and we kind of gradually, and we started in politics, and really with a very intense focus on like, what are people on Twitter talking about? What questions are they asking? You would see a news story about a bombing in Syria, and that the Israelis had bombed some installation near the border of Syria, and everybody on the internet would be saying like, I wonder what the militant group Hezbollah is going to do. But nobody would pick up they have a spokesman in Beirut, and nobody would pick up the phone. Like, it was like all these conversations. And for a while, our real niche was to say like, well, I don't know, like the people on the internet are asking this question. We are going to call Beirut and ask the guy what he says, and then put that back on the internet. And mainstream newsrooms still really weren't doing that. They had a kind of story they were writing. They weren't interested in the questions their audiences were asking. They were interested in the traditional questions that they asked. And so, yeah, I think we really got a lot of mileage out of thinking, what are people actually interested in? The other one that I was recently reminded of, we did early on, we covered, obviously with BuzzFeed, we covered a lot of celebrity stuff. And there was a list of, we had just sort of a photo essay about some Beyonce concert. And her publicist, and they're very, careful about her image. And her publicist sent me an email that was like, excuse me, could you please take down photos number 12, 13, and 47? We don't like those. And so we then went and published another. And I think for news organizations that lived, or sort of, celebrity websites that lived inside this celebrity bubble, that was a normal thing to do. For us, we published a new post that was like, here are the photographs Beyonce's publicist doesn't want you to see. And because like we knew our audience would want that. And that was, I think she's still mad at me, I heard. But in any case, not Beyonce, she has no idea who I am, but her publicist. But I think we were able to sort of, I don't know, we had this, we came from the internet, we didn't play by the conventional rules, and we thought really all the time about what would our audience share, which is a pretty good proxy for what's news. Now, and I was there through 2008, and through 2016. Sorry, no, gosh, I'm becoming the kind of person who doesn't know what year it is. This is because it's 2020. I was there from 2012 until March of this year. And, BuzzFeed went from being this like strange, outsidery thing that only had cats to obviously still kind of a strange thing with a lot of cats and also a lot of journalism that was very kind of, always woven into the internet. But the thing that I think happened over the last few years is that we just watched while these organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular really caught up with us. We watched them taking tricks that we had learned about, how to work on the internet, and then using, the strength of the New York Times brand or the Washington Post brand, using, their resources, their technology to often start to beat us at our own game in some ways, which was quite frustrating. And also, I think, this is now where it sort of, I guess, partly comes to the professional advice section, or at least here is what the media landscape looks like now. Because I think when I was, the period from really the beginning of my career through maybe 2016 was about this huge profusion of exciting new outlets coming into existence and competing with these kind of hidebound old television networks and newspapers, and really giving them a run for their money. And it was very exciting to be part of that. There's a kind of like Empire Strikes Back quality to what's happening now. The New York Times, the Washington Post, are probably stronger than they have ever been. New York Times has more journalists than it's ever had. And and I think if you're looking for a job in journalism now, there are sort of two directions. And one is that like the biggest players are getting bigger, like the New York Times and CNN just had incredible years. And part of this obviously is that Donald Trump is obsessed with them and kind of entered into this feedback loop with them where like he was attacking them, and every time he attacked them, they would get more subscribers. and all and his staff knew that like he was obsessed with the New York Times, so they would, if they wanted his attention, leak things to the New York Times. I mean, it was, sort of this very bizarre pathological cycle that is, kind of coming to an end. But he wasn't that interested in the internet, so he really like fueled these older media outlets, but also they kind of figured it out. I mean, I think they have adapted pretty well to this new environment. The biggest podcast in the country is from the New York Times. If you look at the Washington Post, New York Times, just their websites, their technology, the ways they try to get you to subscribe have gone from being like, we're putting a PDF up on our server, to really, really sophisticated stuff. And so on one hand, I think even more than when I started out, there are these big traditional outlets that are doing interesting stuff and that are not stuck in the past. And then on the other hand, there are a lot of small new things. I think, the biggest tragedy in American media of the last, 50 years is the kind of slow decline of regional American newspapers. It used to be every city had a, one or two or three great, pretty strong newspapers. When I was in Indianapolis, my first day was the day that they shut down, that the afternoon paper died. And so I got a pretty good sense like, I'm not sure about the future of this business. But those the places that have been hardest hit, and the places where it used to be would normally be your first job, would be, right, the Indianapolis Star, the Newsday on Long Island, which is doing okay, but these sort of, regional metropolitan papers that just employed a lot of people, and those places have all been in this slow decline. And so, but what's been coming up to replace them is a wave of small, scrappy, often nonprofit news outlets. Some of them local, like The City in New York is a quite good new nonprofit. And then there are places like Chalkbeat, or the Marshall Project, nonprofits that specialize in education. And so I think, and there are increasingly ways for them to, get a few thousand subscribers and pay the bills. It's also now much more possible than it really ever was for an individual journalist to go out and make a living with a newsletter. And there was, and if you have if you write about climate and you have a very specific point of view, and you have a few thousand people who might want to read you every day, you can build a really, there's a woman named Emily Atkin who writes a newsletter called Heated, who, has built a really strong audience around her own voice, her own perspective on a platform called Substack. And so I think like the biggest picture feature of the news landscape right now is, on one hand, these giants getting bigger and stronger. And then on the other, these like tiny little new things that are, I think, probably quite exciting to be a part of and pretty fun right now, but also risky and fragile, and who knows what will happen with them. And the place where like we all used to start our careers, which was the middle, which was a medium-sized paper in Indianapolis, they're, still great places to work if you can find a job there, but I think have become really hollowed out. And so it's this kind of strange kind of barbell shaped media landscape where, the big and the little are doing well, and the middle is really struggling. And so I think that's that's kind of the big picture. I guess the other like piece of advice that I would give, and when people sort of ask about starting their careers, and I don't know, I mean, I hope like sometimes this advice is geared to people who spend a lot of time on Twitter, because like a lot of young journalists spend a lot of time on Twitter. I mean, a lot of us have had Twitter. I mean, obviously I spent a lot of time on Twitter, and it has like melted my brain. But what you find on Twitter are often these like very heated debates about like objectivity and, what should journalism really be about, and about the role of like your personal views and your identity in the coverage you do. And those are all like really interesting conversations, but the way to, or at least one way, and my sort of preferred way to really succeed in the business, is through reporting and through telling stories that that nobody's told before, and breaking news and getting scoops. And you don't always know really what and then you can let the people who like to argue about things on Twitter argue about the thing that you wrote. And that's sort of what I've been trying to do I have this kind of fun, I was in management for 8 years basically, and it's been really fun to get back to reporting for me over the last year. But the really thing I've been trying to do, because rather than just sort of like go out there with like hot takes and get myself canceled or try to cancel people. Just, just to try to like provide grit. Like there's such heated arguments happening all the time on the internet. And I think if you're doing good reporting, you can add information that then other people can argue about, but you don't always have to, you don't have to decide what it means, and you don't always have to know what the consequences are. I think that's, to me, like one of the kind of interesting and challenging things about this business, and something that's like taken me a long time to sort of to I don't know, to get comfortable with. And I'm maybe not really that comfortable with it now, but just maybe I'll end with like a couple of anecdotes about this, but that you really like, it can be really hard to know what the consequences of publishing that things will be. And you sort of have to just steel yourself to not knowing. And when I was a young reporter in Eastern Europe, actually, I was in Belarus, which is this country that has this like perpetual, they're all in the streets protesting the same dictator who they were protesting when I was there in 2001. But there was I wrote about this young protester, this young kind of opposition leader, and I wrote about how he told me how he would go to Poland and pick up suitcases full of cash from the US government and bring them back to like, finance the protests, which was like pretty controversial. And I couldn't believe he told me, but it was a great story. So I wrote it. And the next time I was in the country, the number 2 guy at the US embassy pulled me aside and yelled at me and told me how irresponsible I'd been, and told me that this guy, Alexei, had been thrown in jail and beaten because of my story. And which was like, I don't know, like something that really like I thought about a lot for many years. And I would Google his name sometimes, and like, I don't know, sort of before social media, I know how to find him, but I always felt like I shouldn't have published that story. And like, and it just sort of shadowed, like it was a thing I thought about when I was doing other stories. And then like year before last, I just had I Googled the guy's name, and there was an article, a profile of him popped up in some publication in the Czech Republic. And I read it, I kind of Google translated it. And among other things, it said he'd never been to jail. And so I found him on Facebook and looked him up and asked him like, hey, like, this guy told me that you were in jail and you were beaten. He was like, no, that never happened. And so I tried to find the guy who had told me that, and he wouldn't call me back, but he's still around. And I finally found the ambassador, his boss. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry about that. Like John would just lie to people, and like, sorry, you had to deal with that. So I finally had to fire him for doing stuff like that. And so it's like, I don't know. It's like, and it was, so that was, so just, one of those things you don't really, it's hard to know, and I guess I kind of in retrospect feel like, what, my job was to publish the story, and you can't get too in your head about what the consequences are going to be. And the other time when I did that, I think obviously was the Steele dossier, which was this very sensitive set of unconfirmed allegations about Donald Trump that we had, a number of news outlets had, that BuzzFeed had, that we'd all been kind of trying to confirm and been unable to confirm. And in January of 2017, it was reported that that this document was was shaking things up so much that it had been briefed to the President of the United States, Obama, to the incoming President Trump, that it was being discussed at kind of the highest levels of power. And so we decided to publish it, not because we knew it was true, but because it was itself this sort of important document that was having all this impact. I think at the time people said, wow, thank you for publishing this. You've exposed all these dark secrets about Donald Trump. Later, conservatives said, thank you for publishing this because you discredited this campaign against Donald Trump. And I think if you ask now, like, what were the political consequences of publishing it? I don't really know. I think it's like, give me another 10 years. And that's a bit of an uncomfortable position to be in. But I think, if you find something out about like, what's going on at SUNY Old Westbury, and you publish, there's an impulse to think like, wow, if I publish this, who will be mad at me? Who's going to get into trouble? What will happen? And the reality is often you don't really know. And the job is to kind of not overthink that and just to publish it. And if you can, find information that people will be interested in and publish it, that's a pretty good path to a career. I mean, not the only one, but it's a pretty good one. So I don't know. That's all I got as far as sort of prepared remarks, but I would love to chat with you guys more.
Hey, Brianna, who has been instrumental in putting this together, and Andy, who also has been extremely helpful. Does either one of you want to start with the questions? Brianna, you want to start?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So what I'm going to do, everyone, is I'm going to go through your questions. I will call on you to for you to ask that question directly to Ben Smith, and he will definitely answer the questions. So the first person I'm going to start is Karina Kovic, and she talked about MSNBC and investigative reporting. So Karina, if you would like to share your question to Ben Smith right now, please do so.
Yeah, I saw an article on Twitter this morning from MSNBC, and the title was Senator McConnell's COVID-19 inaction shows he's willing to inflict pain and suffering on millions of Americans. And right now I'm reading Slanted by Cheryl Atkinson about slanted media and media bias. Do you think the media will ever change back over time to the original investigative reporting? And who do you think is kind of like leading that bias from like on top?
That's, it's a good question. And I think part of it is that, media is used to having, that legacy media, places like like MSNBC, like the New York Times, are used to having a kind of an audience who knows that there is a distinction between news reporting and opinion, and that distinction is drawn really clearly. Like in the New York Times, it used to be, or if you pick up the print paper, the first 23 pages of the first section are news, and then first 22 pages, and then pages 23 and 24 are editorials, and they have names, and you can kind of like tell that they're opinion. And when you like tweet out a headline on Twitter, none of that is clear. And I don't really think it's your fault or the audience's fault. I think it's these news organizations' fault that it's pretty hard to distinguish when they're saying, well, this is our reporting and this is opinion. And I just kind of pulled up the tweet you mentioned. For instance, that was a comment by one of their theoretically opinion hosts, a guy named Mehdi Hassan, about a story that was like kind of a straight story about McConnell. I'm sorry, that it was an opinion piece by this guy, Mehdi Hassan. I mean, and it says the word, if you click that link, it says the word opinion, like you have to wear glasses to see it. It's like the size of it's like the smallest font I've ever seen on the internet. And so I would not blame anyone for thinking that that's like, that they, I mean, I think basically it's cheap and easy to produce opinion, and it gets a lot of traffic, and a lot of news outlets have tilted themselves toward doing opinion while still sort of pretending they're keeping it separate from their news operation, and they're not doing a particularly good job of it. That, to me, strikes me as a good example of that. I think there are other biases. Like there are sort of, I think that's a little different from an allegation that there's sort of like pervasive liberal or conservative bias or sort of whatever kind of bias across a news organization. Like that's a thing that if you really press them on it, they'd say, hey, that's opinion. It says in 2-point font, it's opinion. Can't you see that? Whereas I think the sort of more, in a way, like the harder questions are like, if you go to the New York Times newsroom, it's a bunch of college graduates who live in New York, who like eat at certain restaurants and have certain tastes in music, and like are, and I mean, to me, like one big story, they're all college graduates. Like that's a minority of the country and reflects a certain kind of point of view on the world. Diminishingly, but still, disproportionately white. And so, relatively few evangelical Christians. Like and so I think inevitably, you're going to see elements of that. So the sort of cultural biases bleed into the coverage. I mean, I think honestly, like everybody does come from somewhere, and the best you can do is sort of be self-aware about it and check it and be transparent about it. And it's also true that, if your job is to write a story about a plane crash, like fundamentally, you got to like get the names of the survivors and the names of who died, and your background may not matter that much. And a lot of journalism, not all of it by any stretch, but is really a profession where there are rules and you should follow them and figure out and your job is just to tell people what happened and keep yourself out of it. I think there used to be a kind of a myth or I'm not even sure anybody ever really believed this, that, reporters could be these like totally neutral robots who totally kept themselves out of it. And often what that really meant was like it was a bunch of white guys who went to the same schools who believed that their sort of perspective represented the universal perspective. And I think that idea has sort of been abandoned, but what replaces it is, unclear. But I also think, I don't know, I don't totally agree with Cheryl Atkinson on this stuff either. I'll recommend other books.
Okay,
Next
Andy or Brianna, you want to ask the next question?
Up next, we have Raul Andrade. Mr. Andrade, do you want to come on mic and ask your question about the future of print journalism?
Yes, sorry, I'm just chewing on something. I apologize.
I'd like to ask my question, Andy. Did you
All right,
skip it over?
Lisa, go ahead and then.
Oh,
then
yeah, you
back
did.
to, the other one.
Raul's my student. He was just saying he's not prepared. When you finish, Raul, go ahead, Raul.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I just was chewing on something. My question was pretty short. Is there a future, you think, for print journalism, or are all viable job options for journalists going to be through using the internet or television as their medium?
I think that like sort of the distinction has collapsed between what's print and what's internet. Like I think if you're a New York Times reporter, well, then you probably still want your story to be on A1, and I think some people still care about that. But I think most journalists are thinking about an audience on the internet primarily, but also like apparently my stories run on page A1 of the business section every Monday, and I think that's kind of cool. Like my mom sees it there, and that makes me happy. But the actual thing I do, is I like the story gets published and I throw a link to it in my tweet deck and like see who's tweeted it and who's talking about it and what they're saying. And I think, I think increasingly these news organizations make their money online and are becoming digital businesses through subscription. And so I think you'll continue, not that they won't print newspapers for as long as it kind of makes sense commercially to print newspapers, but I'm not sure how much longer that'll be. And I think that it doesn't really make sense to think about it, like really to even think about there being a distinction. There's stories people want to read. There's videos that are going to increasingly play on, television and the internet and these over-the-top platforms, that some of which are also distributed on television and some of which only live in places like Roku. And, you can kind of make yourself crazy thinking about the distinctions between them. But I think there's a lot of convergence between them. And then I think in terms of what happens if the thing you really, really love is chopping down trees and putting ink on what comes out of them, like, I do think that there's room for, like, there will be like, print. I mean, the book business continues to do pretty well. And I think there is like really like lovely, valuable objects that are going to stick around for a while and that you might want to look at more than once. I think print does actually sort of endure for those. But I think for something that's like, here's the quickest way to get you a piece of information is this: we're going to chop down a bunch of trees, just turn them into paper, and then we're going to bring all that in giant rolls to a factory, and we're going to stamp the information on that paper, and then we're going to put it in a truck and we're going to drive it to you. Like, that's just not like the most efficient way to get you information in the year 2020. And so I don't think the notion that like a daily newspaper or hitting your stoop hot off the press is only 12 hours after the news happened is really like, doesn't make much sense.
Okay, Lisa, you have a question? Lisa Payton?
Yes, hi, how are you? Thank you for joining us. I was wondering your opinion. How do you think Trump will or should be covered after the inauguration by news organizations?
Oh my God. It's a good question. I mean, the thing about Trump is that he's so interested in media. Like, he's always been primarily kind of a media character. His most successful business venture was The Apprentice, working for NBC. And he like is so intertwined with and kind of understands media so well and is obsessed with it. And so, if he was going out there and saying something that wasn't true, as often as not, it was to kind of bait the media into saying the president said this thing that wasn't true and get into a big fight about it. And then I do think one of the things that's happening now, based on talking to people kind of around the White House, is that he sort of is going to have to deal with the fact that, like, he thinks people cover everything he does because he's Donald Trump, but in fact they cover everything he does because he's the president of the United States. And you already sort of feel the air coming out of that. Like, if the president of the United States says something false and really provocative, it's probably news because he's the president. If, like, the former president says it, like, who cares? And so I think I think there will be less coverage. That said, he is great at getting attention, and he understands these dynamics and should be, better than anybody. And I'm sure we'll figure out ways to stay relevant because he does like to be relevant.
Okay, Terry Ann, you want to ask your question?
Sure. I just wanted to ask, hi, first of all, it's a pleasure. Wanted to know if you feel like apps such as the Citizens app that civilians can kind of report the news, if it helps or hinders the news that we have today.
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
I wanted to know if you feel that the apps we have, such as the Citizens app, where people can report their own news in a sense, will help or hinder the news in the future.
Oh, I'm not sure. I think of it like, I'm not sure I caught the name of the app you're talking about, but I do think, but I do think that, like, the fact that, like, essentially everybody across lots and lots of platforms can, bear witness to what's going on around them, if nothing else, and can share information has really, like, changed has really made, in a way, forced, I think, professional journalists to say, like, okay, like, standing here with a phone taking a picture of a thing is not adding a whole lot of value, and a lot of people can do that. So, like, what is a professional journalist doing in this situation? And I think sometimes really it's verifying it and saying, like, hey, this thing you saw on the internet is real and this one is false, and really being an expert in doing that. But I think, right, there's so much information and so much content and so much media now that often the thing that news organizations can do most valuably is, like, be a guide and kind of steer people through that, as much as bear witness and kind of present the thing itself. And I do think that's a huge shift.
Noelle?
Thank you.
Noelle, you want to ask your question, please?
Sure. Hi. So I recently read Hoax by Brian Stelter, and he wrote specifically about Fox News and how they failed their viewers by spreading false information about the pandemic. An unknown number of people might have died because of the information they spread. Do you think that news sites will be held accountable for spreading disinformation about the pandemic?
I mean, basically, no. The First Amendment has pretty strong protections for it, which is unusual in the United States. I think in a lot of other countries, if you had a television network broadcasting false news about a pandemic, they would shut you down. For better and for worse. I think, mostly for better, but public health crises are a really unusual situation. There's nothing like that here. Television broadcaster, it's interesting, actually. It's something there is a lot of regulation around broadcast television. And so if NBC News were to air false misleading information about a pandemic, they could face huge fines, actually. But cable and internet can really say whatever the hell they want and get lots of people hurt. And unless they give very, very specific advice, like if they say to you, like, go to the store, buy a bottle of bleach and drink it, maybe they can get into trouble. But just sort of throw, kind of kicking up dust and calling science into question I don't really think there have been or will be any consequences for them.
Brianna, you want to?
Yeah, so I see that Jimmy Kelleher asked a question regarding fake news and bad reporting. So Jimmy, if you can ask your question to Mr. Smith.
Yes, hi, Mr. Smith. Thank you for joining us and taking your time. My question really is just how to combat fake news and bad reporting. Like, what are ways, like, as a student or scholar, that you can go on and think ahead and be smarter and kind of separate wrong information from right information, and how you would be able to tell the difference with, like, all information going around right now. It seems as if there's there's no cap on the amount of information that you can kind of intake. So I was just wondering through your experience. Yeah.
I mean, I think, there are a couple of things. I mean, one is just to sort of figure out sources that you can trust and follow and stick to those, which can be publications, can be individual reporters, um, and particularly on issues a lot about, right? Like you can sort of say like, hey, I actually know something about this and this person is getting it right or wrong. I mean, I think if you watch, I think most, there's this old sort of famous thing about the New York Times, said about the New York Times, which is that if you read a New York Times article about China, you say like, wow, like they know so much about China. It's amazing. If you read a New York Times article about Old Westbury, you're like, oh my God, these people are idiots. They know nothing. And so I think it's, that's challenging, but I think, yeah, I think finding trusted sources and following them. And then I think the main thing though, is to be skeptical of things that just feel so true. Like if you see something that it like plays to like everything you already believed, like, I mean, did turn out to be true that the Patriots were cheating, but like, but if you see a story that is like the politician who you hate most is secretly like a pedophile and a thief, you should like be careful with that one. Like the things you fall for are the ones that you want to believe. And the way a lot of this fake news, like the sort of like commercial grade fake news that's just meant to go viral on social media and trick people, it's really about thinking like, wow, like what do people like really, really want to be true? And then playing to that. And so I actually think it's like this story, and I think this is a huge problem for journalists too. I mean, it's always been, there's sort of a famous saying that like that you shouldn't root for the story, and that it's risky. Like if you get a tip, you've got to be careful that you're not going out there like wanting it to be true and almost like subconsciously finding things that confirm it. And yeah, I think that's actually the main thing as a consumer, is to be really aware of your own confirmation bias and just sort of like be most skeptical of the things you most want to believe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Professor Matson, do you want to present a question from any of the students? Okay. All right. Well, okay. So a question from a student. So Rayham, you talked about ethnicities and bilingual. Do you mind presenting your question to Mr. Smith?
Yeah, sure. So my question, like I said, is very specific. But how would you advise those with like dual ethnicities or bilingual skills to take advantage of that for their own good, since like the journalism field in general is very challenging and it's very hard to have everybody standing out when they're applying for a job, especially in the beginning of their career?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge asset, honestly. And I think you should, I guess, the advice I've given reporters has always, and this is not like, it's sometimes a little cynical, but like, you're right, it's this incredibly competitive business. You should use like anything that you can use as an advantage, you should use as an advantage in terms of your skills and sort of your knowledge. It's funny you mentioned that. I have a reporter of mine at BuzzFeed who was a devout Mormon, and was like McKay Coppins, who's now at The Atlantic, and was like the only Mormon at the a top level of American political journalism, and was covering Mitt Romney. And he reminded me recently that I told him that he needed to tell all his sources on the Romney campaign that he was the only Mormon covering them, and he was gonna get fired if he didn't get scoops. And so they had to give him scoops, which was like kind of cynical and manipulative, but like, you're trying to get information from people. I think in terms of language skills, like particularly in the beginning of your career, I think if you can find stories that other people aren't finding, in a community that really well, that's really valuable. I think it's, it can then be a challenge though, to write about your community in a big publication that even if you get the community and even if the story is really well done and well framed, that is going to be kind of sometimes perceived as a sort of outside attack on that community. And I think that can be really tricky. I think it's something, but not a reason not to do it, just a thing to be careful about and straight up about when you're talking to people, and sort of like make sure the people you're talking to understand that you're not just like a kid from the community asking them a question, but that this is going to show up in a big publication in that context. But I think, so few, like a lot of American journalists are monolingual, and if you have a language skill and an insight into a community, like there are stories in every corner, and often really big, interesting stories that often you have an advantage for sure if you speak the language, if you're part of that community. And so, yeah, I would just treat it like as a straight ahead advantage, basically.
Amanda, you have a question about whether the nature of the internet has made libel more difficult to prove. You want to ask that, please?
Yeah, you were talking about Twitter and how, people can't be penalized for spreading false news. So I just wanted to know, like, what about libel, and like, I was wondering if it was hard to prove, like, because of the internet.
I mean, libel, let's see. I mean, I think the thing is that libel is like most falsehoods are legal, right? Like you can just go out there and lie about stuff and it makes you a jerk, but it's not illegal. And, libel and defamation are these like very specific and kind of narrower than you think kind of legal categories where it's like, it has to be false, it has to be malicious, it has to be deliberately false, be able to prove it's deliberately false, and it has to have damages. So you have to be able to prove that there's like a financial cost to you for this. And American libel, I mean, in a lot of other countries, again, libel laws are much, much more stringent. In the US, I mean, I think basically, fortunately, they're not. And so most of the false and malicious garbage on the internet isn't technically libelous, but some is. And you could get sued just as easily for a tweet as you could for a broadcast on the CBS Evening News. And people sometimes do. And, please don't libel people. But I think it's just, the amount of effort that goes into filing a lawsuit against an anonymous Twitter user mostly means that people don't do it.
I'd like to interject a question here, if I may. Picking up from your earlier point about when you started working in Eastern Europe, the question is truth versus ethics, truth versus hurting someone. Are there any other examples that you can give, and how do you draw the line that you have to get the story out, but yet at the same time you might be hurting someone or many people?
I mean, I think that's a thing that, that's important to take into account. And I think, but with a certain level of realization that you often don't really know, and that you can overestimate your own ability to know the consequences of a story. But I guess the way I think about it, it comes up often in terms of, are you going to name someone, right? Like the most sort of run-of-the-mill ways, right? Somebody committed a minor crime or says something to you that could get them into some trouble, and I think the older newspaper rule is like, you know what, sorry, buddy, we're using your full name, we're using your mugshot. And I do think that increasingly, because of the internet, there's a sense of like, well, like it's one thing if that runs in the print newspaper on one day and that thing then gets pulped and maybe you had a bad day. It's another thing if that lives on Google forever. And it's disproportionate. And so I think certainly at BuzzFeed, we sort of shifted to being much more comfortable finding ways to have a story that didn't like link to somebody's identity on Google for the rest of their lives. And often people will, long after a story has been published, get in touch with you and say, like, hey, like I stole a car when I was 17, and the first thing that happens when you Google me is this thing, and like it feels unfair, and kind of, again, like I went to jail, I got out of jail, and still the only thing that, or alternately, there was a report saying that I was arrested for stealing a car. It's the first thing that comes up on Google. The case was later dismissed, and like it's still, and I think older line media tend to be pretty rigid and say, sorry, that's the story, it's not changing. I think they should be much more open to changing it, basically, because like the way we think about this wasn't really built for the internet.
Brianna, you want to choose something?
So Kevin Kalina, he said that he has an interest in NPR and politics. So Kevin, would you mind presenting your question to Mr. Smith?
Yes, of course. Thank you for presenting my question. I just wanted to know, I have an interest in NPR and politics, and I also have an interest in history and education. So I was wondering if you have any advice on any avenues I can pursue, especially in journalism. How can I apply that? Or
I mean, I think, I mean, it's interesting. Like one of the booming fields right now is audio journalism,
okay,
because, podcasts there's a lot of investment in podcasts for a number of different reasons. And I think, the thing that people are like often scrambling to hire these days are people with audio production skills. Like that's probably like the most in demand mini slice of news right now, is the ability to sort of like, obviously like do the technical stuff, like record and edit really fast and clean and mix, but also I think to think about how you tell stories in audio. And I think there is a lot of that's sort of a boom right now. And I think that, yeah, if what you want to wind up doing is, producing or covering politics at NPR, I think figuring out how to produce podcasts is actually a pretty good skill.
okay, thank you.
So, okay, yes. So another student, Kyle Berthoud, he wanted to clarify something that you mentioned, Mr. Smith, earlier. So Kyle, do you mind presenting that question that you mentioned?
Yeah, so earlier you said that this whole journalism thing has an Empire Strikes Back feel to it. Like, I just wanted to see if you could expand on that.
Yeah, it's like, I'm thinking like fourth episode of The Mandalorian. No, no, I just that basically, like, when I was sort of your age, there was a sense that that the New York Times, CNN, CBS were like these kind of ancient giant companies that were kind of tottering and were never going to be able to catch up to the internet age, and that all the action was at places like places like Politico, like BuzzFeed, like these sort of new startups that were challenging them. And it was just very hard to imagine how a place like the Times could ever get itself onto the internet. Like it was just full of reporters who hated the internet and didn't understand it, and kind of institutionally had this really hostile attitude toward the internet, and it was ridiculous, actually. And I think basically once they decided that, like, we got to get this right, they moved kind of faster and more effectively than people expected. And I also think the brand, the trust in the New York Times, and like had more power than people expected. Like you've been doing something for 150 years, and people, like, it gives you a certain amount, it buys you a little bit of time to figure out how to make the transition. And so, yeah, I guess I just think that if like in terms of what I'm surprised about, I would not have predicted in 2015, it's how strong places like the Times and CNN are. I mean, the Times, maybe 2013, 2014 had to like rent out sublet half its office space to keep the cash flow coming in. Like these businesses were in real trouble. And I think they've figured out digital subscription businesses way faster than anybody expected.
Okay, thank you.
So another student, Melissa Rosello, has a question regarding social media. So Melissa, would you like to present your question?
Yes, hi, how are you? How is everybody? So I was basically just touching on the topic of cancel culture on Twitter, being that it's just so aggressive on social media, and it's really hard to even put out a simple tweet. So how can you go about like having the confidence to put out an article, something that you write? You understand?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that social media can be really kind of awful, right? And like punish people for, making small mistakes, or actually not making mistakes, but just, kind of, and I mean, I guess my own strategy is essentially, look, like, I'm a reporter, I'm going to tell you what's happening. I'm not going to tell you what to think of it. If you want to argue with, if you want to have fights with the people I'm quoting, go ahead. But I'm sort of going to hold my own cards fairly close to my chest in a certain way, and not really like be in the argument. I also think it's like one of the things that good editors do is make sure that your story is kind of bulletproof, and that you're not going to you're not sort of leaving yourselves open to attacks, and that's a really important thing that editors can do. And then inevitably somebody's gonna get mad at you at some point, and you just, delete Twitter for a day and it'll be gone the next day.
Okay. So another student, Tamia Hubbard, who is a staff member of the Catalyst, have a question for you regarding advice that that you may want to share for media and communication students. So Tamia, would you like to present your question to Mr. Smith?
Hi, I was just wondering if you have any advice for media and communication students who are about to graduate or perhaps recently graduated.
Yeah, and actually, I had one more additional answer to the previous question, and then I'll answer this one, which was just that I don't mean to be dismissive of feedback on social media. Actually, like sometimes people are mad at you on social media and it's really valuable, and you can, if you sort of take a breath, be like, oh, you know what, like you had a point, and make your work better. Obviously depends on the specifics. Advice, I mean, this is such I'm sure you're getting advice from people who understand more than I do what a strange moment this is to graduate and into the media business. And a lot of these businesses are, not in fantastic financial shape, but although I think that for the news industry, it has not been as bad a year as people feared it was going to be. If you'd asked them in February, March of this year. But I think it's, my own, advice is that if you can get a job that interests you, doing stuff that interests you anywhere, that's worth trying to do. And that there's this pull to New York City and to see if you can get a job, getting coffee for somebody's assistant at Condé Nast, and that you're better off, producing segments on the overnight in Dayton and getting really good at that. And than you are having some job at NBC where you're never actually getting anywhere near journalism. And that often I think that the two paths mostly are to kind of get out of the New York City area if you can, and get a kind of weird, shitty job, but where you're actually on the front line doing stuff in a small market, whether it's TV or whether it's, a local news nonprofit or whatever, or alternately go work for a giant institution in New York and work your way up. And they're both kind of valuable paths. But I think that ultimately, if you're doing the actual work that really interests you, it's worth kind of living somewhere less interesting for a little while, which could of course turn into a long time. But I think that and in fact, one of the maybe the only upside of how tough it is in local newspapers these days is that if you can get a job at a local newspaper or a local TV station, they're so hollowed out that where it used to be that you'd be covering the prize pig at the state fair, because that's what junior reporters did, you'll be covering, murders on your first day because they don't have enough reporters anymore. So, that's the upside.
Brianna, we have time, I think, for one more question or so.
I don't think there's any more new questions, but Payton, go ahead.
How do we get people to believe that journalists are telling the truth moving forward? Believe in journalism again. I feel like, the stigma from the last 4 years about everything being fake news and not believing that journalists have a commitment to the truth. How do we re-engage the public and make them believe in journalism again?
I mean, yeah, that's the $1 million question. I mean, I don't think there's a simple answer, because there's so many both political and kind of commercial interests in telling a subset of people that the things that other people believe are lies. And I think if you look at polls that show declining trust in journalism, it's actually sort of a misleading number. What's happening is one group of people believe more in journalism than they ever did, and whereas other people really hate journalism, and it's sort of segmented. I guess to me, the only mildly optimistic thing is that a lot of that happens in this kind of toxic bubble around national politics and around Donald Trump and around, whatever. But if you're reporting on a controversy around how your local library spent money, or a abuse scandal at the local high school, you don't really run into that dynamic. Like people may be upset about the story. They may not feel treated fairly, but ultimately they don't think you're making it up, and it's not, and you don't have the sort of local officials saying this is fake news and anybody believing them. And I actually think like the more energy and attention is put into sort of covering these stories that are like really local and that people can kind of feel and touch, that's stuff that people can trust, even if they're skeptical about what they're seeing on cable news.
Okay, great. All right, we're really just about out of time. And on behalf of the students and the Old Westbury community in its entirety, Ben, I want to thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And I'll give you the last word unless Brianna wants to say one last point.
No, well, thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. Thanks, John. Thanks, Brianna. It's nice to meet you all.
Good. Thank you again very much.
Thank you.
I think we all should give a round of applause to Ben Smith. I look forward to reading your future columns, which are superb. Thank you again.